I want to tie that kind of storytelling to something you wrote in I guess, an op-ed not long ago. Let me just read from it. It says, stories that illuminate the experience of otherness or marginalization or exclusion are the stories that the majority culture often feels most comfortable telling because stories of ordinary people or the stories of simple human struggles are still seen as the domain of white people. Because for so long, normal people on TV, as you said, and in movies have been white people. Everyone else was other. Could you talk a bit about that? In this thing, you also deploy the phrase that I think is quite interesting and compelling of psychic colonialism. And I think, could you talk a bit about how in your work and in the kind of roles you want to play or are playing, you're kind of breaking down that psychic colonialism that you felt in the past?
Yeah, I mean, psychic colonialism for me is sort of an internalization of white supremacy, and the internalizing of that white people, for so long when I was starting out in Hollywood, like it was always about, like, white, like I said in that op-ed, like white people were the norm, and then everyone else was other, and everything that people of color did, or the stories that were interesting, were always stories that were in relation to white people, in relation to the white gaze, like our own relationship to our identity, our own immigrant experience, our own story of otherness or marginalization or racism or disenfranchisement, whatever that was. And it was always in relation to the white gaze and the white popular culture. And that was internalized. Even the stories that I told and that as a writer that I wanted to tell, I felt like I needed to tell those stories in relationship to what was digestible and acceptable for the popular culture, that being the majority white culture. And often the stories that were the most interesting for that majority white culture were the stories of my own marginalization or my own, um, just, otherness. Other than, so I never, in my own self, never felt like I had the agency to explore stories of human stories of depression or marital strife or drug abuse or whatever, or just personal sort of stories of like my own mundane stories of human life, like those stories were sort of reserved for quote unquote white people, and because it's like the death of a salesman type story I could not tell. It was like, well, why would these people not just be white then? If you're going to tell a story about a man struggling with his own, family and his own demons, then just make them white, because then they'll be more relatable. And that was kind of the sort of what I would hear. So I think that is still where we need to go in terms of representation. I feel like culturally and in terms of entertainment, in terms of TV and Hollywood and all that, where we still need to go is that area where ultimately, and in that piece I talk about the movie Minari and why I loved it so much, and I thought that it was so brilliant because it did exactly that. It did not apologize for it being just about these people, and it had nothing to do with like whether people would understand, white people, quote unquote, the majority culture, and I use that as sort of a term that they would or would not understand it. And so that's what I mean by sort of psychic colonialism, in the sense that like I internalized all of that. I internalized all of that adoration, and maybe it comes from also like an internalized real colonialism that happened to our people generations, over like the past few generations. I think there is in the sort of South Asian, psyche, a kind of adoration of Western ideals and culture that was sort of implanted into us by the British, and this idea that everything that is Western is superior and better than what we have, what is true to our own culture, and so that I think is something that we struggle with still, and I think it's up to creators and people in my industry, to challenge that, especially brown creators. I think people like Rami Youssef are, for example, a perfect example of someone who is, I think, challenging that in his show, and not making it for white people, and allowing people to find it rather than bring it in a very palatable way to them, and not worried if it makes people uncomfortable, you know.